Welcome to the Real Free News Podcast. Today we will be discussing the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and relevant events. Abraham Lincoln occupies an exalted pedestal in American mythology as the singular liberator who ended chattel slavery with one stroke of the pen. This narrative dominates public consciousness and educational curricula alike. Yet historical reality dismantles this simplification with surgical precision. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single enslaved person through legal emancipation. Instead, it operated as a wartime confiscation order, transforming human beings into strategic assets seized under executive war powers during an undeclared conflict. Lincoln invoked constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to declare slaves in rebel territories forever free, but only where Union armies could enforce the decree. In areas beyond federal control, the proclamation remained ink without impact. Its true function was military, to deprive the Confederacy of labor, incite internal disruption, and recruit black soldiers into Union ranks. The proclamation's legal foundation rested on the concept of contraband, enemy property subject to seizure. Slaves fleeing to Union lines or liberated by advancing armies became federal wards, not citizens. They entered a liminal status, no longer chattel of Southern masters, yet not free under civil law. The document carried an implicit expiration date. Without constitutional amendment, its effects would dissolve at war's end. This temporal fragility underscores its provisional nature. Lincoln and his cabinet drafted the measure over months, timing its release after the Union victory at Antietam to maximize political capital. The final proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, applied exclusively to states in rebellion, deliberately excluding border states and Union-occupied territories to preserve fragile loyalties. Public misperception persists that 4 million enslaved Africans awoke to freedom on New Year's Day 1863. In truth, the proclamation liberated approximately 0 individuals on the day of signing. Its practical effect unfolded gradually as Union forces penetrated Southern strongholds. Each advance freed clusters of people who then faced recruitment into federal service. Roughly 180,000 black men enlisted, forming 10% of the Union Army by war's end. Their service transformed military demographics and accelerated Confederate collapse. Yet their legal status remained ambiguous: federal contraband, not emancipated citizens. The pathway to genuine liberation required congressional action beyond executive fiat. The 13th Amendment, proposed in 1864 and ratified in December 1865, constituted the sole legal instrument that abolished slavery nationwide. This constitutional change arrived 7 months after Appomattox, confirming that presidential proclamation alone lacked permanence. The amendment's passage occurred under extraordinary conditions. Former Confederate states operated under military governance, their legislatures reconstituted by Union commanders. Ratification became a prerequisite for readmission to the Union, transforming a moral imperative into a political mandate. Citizenship followed separately through the 14th Amendment, proposed in 1866 and ratified in 1868. This measure established birthright citizenship and equal protection under law, provisions absent from Lincoln's vision. The president favored limited suffrage for black veterans and educated men, not universal citizenship. His assassination in April 1865 removed the moderating influence, allowing radical Republicans to impose sweeping Reconstruction. Southern states ratified both amendments under occupation, their compliance extracted through military oversight, economic strangulation, and political exclusion. The entire sequence reveals a calculated escalation of federal power. Lincoln initiated the process through wartime exigency, Congress codified freedom through constitutional amendment, and radical Republicans secured equality through coercive Reconstruction. Each phase built upon the last, culminating in a redefinition of American citizenship. The narrative of presidential emancipation collapses under scrutiny. What began as tactical confiscation evolved into permanent transformation only through layered institutional action, military victory, and post-war domination. Part 1. The Emancipation Proclamation as Tactical Confiscation. The Emancipation Proclamation functioned as a military instrument rather than a humanitarian decree. Issued on January 1, 1863, it declared all enslaved persons in Confederate-controlled territories thenceforward and forever free. This language masked its operational reality. The federal government lacked authority to enforce freedom in areas beyond Union occupation. Where Confederate power prevailed, the proclamation carried no weight. Its immediate legal impact equaled zero. The document targeted approximately 3.1 million enslaved individuals in 10 named states and parts of others, deliberately excluding nearly 800,000 in border regions and Union-held zones. Lincoln crafted the measure as a war power under Article II of the Constitution. Supreme Court precedent in the prize cases upheld presidential authority to treat rebel property as subject to seizure. Slaves constituted the Confederacy's most vital economic asset. Their labor sustained agriculture, logistics, and fortifications. By declaring them contraband, Lincoln aimed to collapse Southern productivity while bolstering Union manpower. The proclamation authorized black enlistment, reversing prior policy that barred African Americans from combat roles. Within months, United States colored troops formed the backbone of numerous campaigns. The drafting process spanned July to September 1862. Lincoln consulted his cabinet repeatedly, revising language to balance military necessity with political viability. He delayed announcement until after Antietam to avoid appearing desperate. The preliminary proclamation issued on September 22 warned rebel states of impending confiscation unless they returned to the Union. None complied. The final version refined exemptions, preserving slavery in loyal areas to prevent border state secession. This selective application exposed the proclamation's strategic calculus. Freedom served Union preservation, not universal justice. Former slaves who reached Union lines entered federal custody as contraband. Military commanders housed them in camps, employed them as laborers, and recruited able-bodied men into service. Women and children received rations but no civil status. The War Department managed these populations, not civilian courts. Their condition improved marginally over bondage, yet they remained federal wards without rights. Pay for black soldiers lagged behind white counterparts, and officers often assigned them hazardous duties. The proclamation transformed human beings into strategic resources, not liberated citizens. Critics at the time labeled the measure executive overreach. Copperheads and border state leaders condemned property confiscation without compensation or due process. The Fifth Amendment appeared violated. Lincoln justified the action through military necessity, arguing that wartime exigency superseded peacetime norms. The Supreme Court never directly ruled on the proclamation's constitutionality during the conflict. Union victory rendered such challenges moot. The document achieved its objectives. Confederate labor collapsed, black recruitment surged, and European powers withheld recognition from a slaveholding rebellion. The proclamation's legacy lies in its catalytic effect. It shifted the war's moral framing, making abolition a Union objective. Yet this transformation occurred incrementally. Each Union advance liberated additional thousands, who then reinforced the invading armies. The snowball effect proved decisive. By war's end, approximately 500,000 formerly enslaved people resided in Union-controlled areas. Their presence demanded post-war resolution. The proclamation created facts on the ground that constitutional amendment would later ratify. Without military success, the document would have remained historical footnote rather than transformative edict. Part 2. The 13th Amendment and the End of Legal Slavery. The 13th Amendment constitutes the sole legal instrument that abolished slavery in the United States. Ratified on December 6, 1865, it declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This simple clause accomplished what the Emancipation Proclamation could not: permanent, nationwide eradication of chattel slavery. The amendment arrived 8 months after Confederate surrender at Appomattox, confirming that presidential action alone lacked constitutional permanence. Congressional debate on the amendment began in 1864. Lincoln prioritized its passage during his re-election campaign, recognizing the proclamation's fragility. The House approved the measure in January 1865 after intense lobbying. Ratification proceeded rapidly among northern states. Southern compliance occurred under military governance. Union commanders oversaw reconstruction of state legislatures, ensuring pro-amendment majorities. Former Confederate states ratified the amendment as a condition of readmission, though Congress later rejected these early votes pending additional requirements. The amendment's text avoided defining freed people's status beyond ending enslavement. It established freedom without addressing citizenship, voting rights, or economic provision. This minimalism reflected political compromise. Radical Republicans sought broader protections, while moderates feared alienating border states. The amendment passed with the understanding that further legislation would address civil rights. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in March 1865, provided temporary federal support: food, medical care, schools, and labor contracts. Its mandate expired in 1869, leaving former slaves vulnerable to Southern retribution. Southern ratification occurred under extraordinary duress. Union troops occupied state capitals. Military governors removed obstructionist officials and installed compliant ones. Economic devastation compounded political pressure. Confederate currency became worthless, plantations lay in ruins, and transportation networks collapsed. Federal authorities controlled food distribution, mail service, and trade. States faced indefinite exclusion from Congress without compliance. Ratification became survival strategy rather than moral conversion. The amendment's passage marked the legal death of slavery, yet practical freedom remained elusive. Southern legislatures immediately enacted black codes to restrict black labor and movement. These laws mandated annual contracts, prohibited vagrancy, and authorized apprenticeship systems that mirrored bondage. Federal military commanders nullified the most egregious provisions, but enforcement varied. The amendment ended legal ownership but not systemic oppression. Northern public opinion supported abolition but divided on implementation. Many whites viewed black freedom as war's consequence, not equality's prerequisite. The amendment satisfied moral imperatives while deferring contentious issues. Citizenship, suffrage, and land redistribution awaited future battles. The 13th Amendment thus represented both triumph and transition. Slavery died constitutionally, while Reconstruction's harder questions emerged. The amendment's legacy extends beyond 1865. Its exception clause permitting involuntary servitude as punishment for crime enabled convict leasing and prison labor systems that targeted Black Americans. Modern incarceration practices trace lineage to this constitutional loophole. The amendment abolished slavery in form while permitting its functional resurrection through state mechanisms. True liberation required ongoing struggle beyond constitutional text. Part 3. The 14th Amendment and Coerced Citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified in July 1868, transformed former slaves into American citizens through birthright and equal protection guarantees. Proposed in 1866, over a year after Lincoln's assassination, the amendment reflected radical Republican dominance rather than presidential vision. Lincoln favored limited black suffrage for veterans and educated men, not universal citizenship. His death removed moderate restraint, enabling congressional hardliners to impose sweeping Reconstruction. The amendment's Citizenship Clause overturned the Dred Scott decision, declaring all persons born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction citizens of the United States and their resident state. The Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses established federal authority to intervene against state discrimination. These provisions addressed Southern black codes that restricted freed people's rights. The amendment also penalized states for denying male suffrage, though women remained excluded. Southern ratification occurred under military Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts. Union generals oversaw voter registration, excluding many former Confederates while enrolling black men. New state conventions drafted constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage. Ratification of the 14th Amendment became mandatory for readmission. Southern legislatures complied under occupation, their votes supervised by federal troops. The amendment's passage required overriding President Andrew Johnson. Johnson vetoed Reconstruction legislation, advocating rapid Southern restoration without black citizenship. Congress overrode his vetoes, then impeached him in 1868, falling one vote short of conviction. Military governors implemented congressional policy directly. Southern states ratified the amendment between 1866 and 1870, with Georgia last under renewed military pressure. The citizenship grant carried profound implications. Former slaves gained constitutional personhood, access to courts, and protection against state oppression. Federal authorities could now intervene when Southern governments violated black rights. The amendment enabled subsequent civil rights legislation, though enforcement remained inconsistent. Southern resistance manifested through violence, legal subterfuge, and eventual redemption governments. Northern support for the amendment reflected wartime sacrifice and moral evolution. Republican dominance in Congress ensured passage. Border states ratified reluctantly, fearing federal overreach. The amendment's Privileges and Immunities Clause promised national rights protection, though courts later narrowed its scope. The Equal Protection Clause became the foundation for 20th-century civil rights litigation. The amendment's coercive nature undermines claims of national consensus. Southern acquiescence resulted from military defeat and occupation, not democratic deliberation. Reconstruction governments operated under federal bayonets. Black voters participated, but white majorities awaited restoration. The amendment imposed citizenship from above, creating tension between legal equality and social reality. The 14th Amendment completed the legal architecture begun by the 13th. Freedom arrived in 1865, citizenship in 1868. Together they reconstituted American identity, though implementation required another century of struggle. The amendment's legacy includes both Brown v. Board of Education and modern privacy rights, demonstrating its expansive interpretation over time. Part 4. Military victory as legal validation. Union military victory transformed constitutionally questionable acts into accepted precedent. The Emancipation Proclamation faced contemporary criticism for executive overreach, property confiscation without due process, and selective application. Lincoln invoked war powers during an undeclared conflict, seizing human property under military necessity. The Supreme Court upheld related actions in the prize cases but never directly ruled on the proclamation. Confederate defeat eliminated legal challenges. Victory rendered theoretical debates academic. Southern courts ceased functioning, Confederate records burned, and rebel leaders faced disqualification or exile. The federal government controlled all mechanisms of legal interpretation. Congress refused to seat Southern representatives until Reconstruction conditions met. Military governors supervised Southern jurisprudence. Federal troops enforced emancipation in practice where presidential proclamation failed in law. The proclamation's practical success validated its strategic wisdom. Confederate labor collapsed as slaves fled to Union lines. Black recruitment provided crucial manpower during 1864 campaigns. European powers withheld recognition from a morally compromised rebellion. Each Union advance liberated additional thousands, who then reinforced the invading armies. The self-reinforcing cycle proved decisive. Southern ratification of constitutional amendments occurred under comprehensive domination. Union armies occupied state capitals. Military commanders removed obstructive officials and installed compliant ones. Economic strangulation complemented physical control. Federal authorities managed food distribution, transportation, and communication. Ratification became prerequisite for basic governmental function. The absence of declared war amplified executive authority. Lincoln treated the conflict as insurrection, preserving the fiction of Union continuity. This framework avoided recognizing Confederate sovereignty while justifying extraordinary measures. Blockades, suspension of habeas corpus, and property confiscation flowed from presidential initiative. Congressional confiscation acts provided statutory cover, but executive action led. Public memory crystallizes around simplified narratives. Lincoln becomes the great emancipator, the proclamation, the liberation moment. Historical complexity dissolves in patriotic mythology. The reality reveals layered institutional action, presidential initiative, congressional amendment, military enforcement, and coercive reconstruction. Each component required the others. Victory provided the indispensable adhesive. The precedent established dangerous possibilities. Future executives could invoke war powers during undeclared conflicts to seize property or suspend rights. The proclamation's success demonstrated that military triumph silences constitutional scrutiny. Legal principle bends before battlefield outcome. The Civil War established victory as the ultimate arbiter of constitutional interpretation. Southern acquiescence masked enduring resentment. Reconstruction governments collapsed by 1877. White supremacy reasserted control through violence and legislation. Jim Crow replaced chattel slavery with segregated subjugation. The amendments remained dormant until mid-20th century activism. Legal equality existed on paper while social reality contradicted constitutional promise. The Civil War amendments collectively represent the most significant expansion of federal power in American history. They shifted authority from states to nation, from property to personhood. This transformation required comprehensive Union dominance. Military victory enabled constitutional revolution. The Emancipation Proclamation initiated the process, but only total defeat permitted its completion. Conclusion: 13th Amendment ended slavery. 14th forced citizenship under Reconstruction duress. The emancipation narrative reveals the chasm between myth and reality in American historical consciousness. Abraham Lincoln did not free 4 million enslaved people with one signature. The Emancipation Proclamation seized Confederate human property as contraband during an undeclared war, transforming strategic necessity into moral crusade. Its effects unfolded gradually through military conquest, not legal transformation. True liberation required the 13th Amendment, citizenship the 14th, both imposed upon a defeated South through occupation and coercion. The proclamation's genius lay in its catalytic function. It converted the war from Union preservation to human liberation, recruiting black soldiers while collapsing Confederate economy. Yet its legal foundation remained fragile. Without constitutional amendment, its provisions would expire with hostilities. The document created facts on the ground that subsequent legislation ratified. Military success transformed provisional confiscation into permanent revolution. Southern ratification of the Civil War amendments occurred under comprehensive Union control. Military governors supervised state governments. Federal troops occupied legislative chambers. Economic devastation eliminated resistance capacity. Compliance became survival imperative rather than democratic choice. The amendments passed through conquest, not consensus. Reconstruction represented victor's justice codified into constitutional law. The sequence established precedent for executive war powers. Future presidents could invoke military necessity to justify extraordinary measures during undeclared conflicts. The proclamation demonstrated that victory validates constitutionally questionable acts. Legal principle yields to battlefield outcome. The Civil War amendments collectively reconstituted American citizenship through federal domination. Public understanding remains distorted by simplified narratives. Educational curricula present Lincoln as singular liberator, the proclamation as liberation moment. Historical reality reveals institutional layering, presidential initiative, congressional action, military enforcement, and coercive reconstruction. Each phase required the others. Victory provided indispensable validation. The amendment's legacy extends beyond 1868. The 13th Amendment's punishment clause enabled convict leasing. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause required 20th-century activism for implementation. The 15th Amendment's voting guarantee faced immediate Southern circumvention. Legal equality arrived decades before social reality. The emancipation process illuminates federal power expansion. The war centralized authority, transferring sovereignty from states to nation. Property rights yielded to personhood rights. Local control surrendered to federal oversight. This transformation required comprehensive military victory. The Union preserved itself by redefining itself. Southern resistance persisted through violence and legislation. Reconstruction collapsed by 1877. White supremacy reasserted dominance through Jim Crow. The amendments remained constitutional promises awaiting fulfillment. Their activation required another century of struggle. The Civil War ended slavery but initiated the longer battle for equality. The emancipation narrative ultimately reveals American capacity for self-transformation through crisis. Military necessity birthed moral evolution. Provisional measures became permanent principles. Defeat enabled reconstruction. The nation that preserved union through war remade itself through constitutional revolution. The cost was comprehensive domination of the vanquished. The gain was redefinition of American citizenship. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News podcast. Like, share, subscribe, and comment on the decisions that led to these constitutional disasters. Visit realfreenews.com for more real free news, and we will see you next time.